Today is Friday, August 27th, 2021, which means it's Derelict Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? The Shadow Fiend has entered a new state of kitty chaos. On Wednesday, I gave a technical presentation on the robot operating system to a major corporation, followed by a Q&A. After introductions and I started my slideshow, Shadow decided he would take a nap on the Mac Mini. He then discovered my webcam cord was fun to play with. So while I'm giving this presentation, my camera moves across my monitor, tilts upward, and shows a lovely view of the ceiling. While attempting to continue speaking without a beat and keep my thoughts rolling like a professional, I ended up holding the webcam steady, hopefully pointed at my face. Shadow, meanwhile, decided this meant he needed to pull harder on the webcam. For 15 minutes, I held the camera until the slideshow was over. As soon as I quit the slideshow and moved to Q&A, Shadow decided he didn't want to nap there anyway. He deftly untangled himself from the cords to go sit atop the PS4 in a pose of regal victory. I could have fucking killed him. Regardless, no one mentioned the technical difficulties, and the Q&A portion went great. Once again, despite Shadow's best efforts, I persevered in getting shit done. After said presentation was over, I removed my webcam, taped up the wires to my monitor, and now I can hope this won't ever happen again. Right. Hope in one hand, shit in the other, and see which one fills up first. Shadow, however, remains intent that he will be part of live recordings in the future. Such a damn diva. Now that I've hopefully put a smile on your face, let's wipe it away by giving you another episode of the ensuing chaos that is the final stretch of the Derelict Saga. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 38 of Derelict, Trident. Chapter 62. Dickerson didn't want to make a big deal about his leg. He wanted to be nonchalant about it like Elliot had been with his hand. But void did it hurt. Worst of all, he was sure he was running a fever. Could be from the damage to the leg, or maybe that fucking thing had poisoned him. He shivered with pain as the vibroblade cut through the outer radiation suit. It parted easily, although she managed to strike his armor twice. Thankfully, she hadn't been stabbing with it, or it might have gone completely through his suit. She finished with his good leg and peered up at him.
One done. You ready for the—
Just do it before I lose my nerve, please. Mira nodded and bent down again. Dickerson didn't watch. He closed his eyes and tried to ride the wave of vibrations crawling up his suit. They made a sound much like... The vibration in his damaged leg started to ache. Then it began to burn. He gritted his teeth, muted himself, and held out as long as he could before screaming in pain. The millions of searing stabs to his nervous system trickled away until he was left again with a dull ache that occasionally twinged.
Still with me?
Still with you, Dickerson panted. He opened his eyes and used his low-light filters. Mira had completely cut away the outer suit covering his damaged leg and freed it. She still had to cut the middle to unzip his torso, but the worst was over. Until he actually looked at the suit beneath. His leg was broken in more places than he imagined possible. He wasn't sure his knee was holding together by more than a few ligaments, tendons, and a shred of tissue. In other words, his leg was done.
Dickerson, what do you—
Cut me out. She sat for a moment, her fingers clenching and unclenching around the blade's handle. Mira leaned forward and briefly touched her helmet to his. When she leaned back, she cut the rest of the outer suit away. He was still wearing the sleeves, but she could literally lift him out of the suit debris.
Still locked?
She asked. He nodded, both his left and right mag gloves locked to the deck. He wasn't moving. Not yet, anyway. Mira struggled out of her radiation suit, her blobby exterior quickly revealing the armored combat suit beneath. Dickerson's radiation sensors spiked another notch. I think that's our cue, Corporal.
Right,
Mira said. She bent down and quickly severed one of the legs of her radiation suit and cut it into strips. Corporal, we have to go.
1 sec,
she said, and tucked the strips into her pouch. Once she sheathed the blade, she reached down and slipped her hands beneath his torso.
I'm going to lift.
And I'm gonna scream.
Right,
She said with a short-lived chuckle.
1,
She said. Dickerson was about to say 2 when the world filled with blinding pain. He wanted to scream but couldn't even find the breath to do so. Kelly Moore was talking softly to him, trying to reassure him, or so he thought, but he couldn't focus on the words through the pain. Another tug, and he shrieked so hard his voice cracked. Stars filled his vision, and just as he thought he was going to pass out, it was over. He blinked. There was light. Kelly Moore had turned on her suit lights and she held him by the torso. He looked down and saw she'd made a makeshift splint around his leg. He wouldn't be able to put weight on it, but it should hold together if he was careful, and not in gravity. He shook his head hard to try and blink away the tears in his eyes.
Okay?
"Fuck you, Corporal," he breathed.
I'll take that as a yes.
The radiation sensors were rising steadily.
We need
"To go," Dickerson finished for her. "Hit the button and get us the fuck out of here." She snickered.
Was that an order?
He growled into the mic but said nothing. Still, the pain had receded a bit, and he found himself grinning through it. She was about to push a button and take him out into space, where they both had a good chance of ending up on the menu for starfish, pine cones, or whatever had attacked the cylinder. With little to nothing but fumes in their thruster packs, if they got bumped off the surface of the station, there'd be no way to get back. They'd either float into orbit around Neptune or find themselves heading deeper into the Kuiper Belt, but not for very long. If what he suspected was waiting for them just outside the airlock, he wouldn't have to worry about his leg much longer. He groaned as he pulled off his rifle and held it one-handed. The other he maglocked to her back. "Let's do it, boss."
Here we go,
Kelly Moore said, and hit the release. There was no pressure to propel them out into space, but Dickerson still felt as though something moved past them. Debris, maybe. "Or maybe we startled some pine cones," he said to himself, mic muted. Kelly Moore mag-crawled out from the airlock overhang and onto the side of Trident Station. Dickerson reeled when she pivoted and left him staring out into space, where things were hardly uninteresting. A shimmering, indescribable shape hung in space a long distance from Trident Station. Or so he thought. Without context, it was impossible to tell just how large or how far away it really was. Worse, thousands of oblong-shaped creatures floated in herds near the cylinder. What he thought of as starfish squadrons darted through the ZG vacuum like terrestrial birds of prey. He flipped through his camera feeds and saw Neptune shipyards in the distance. A couple of clicks, nothing more. Unlike the cylinder, the shipyards appeared to be vacant of any creatures. No power, no radiation, nothing for them to chew on, he thought. The ambient radiation around them had dimmed, but it was still higher than the normal background levels. They had to get away from the QM modules as fast as they could, and for once, their luck was in because the shipyards was closest.
Shipyards?
Kelly Moore asked. "Read my mind. Let's book it."
Easy for you to say,
Kelly Moore whispered into the mic. Dickerson had already witnessed the Corporal's finesse in ZG, but he'd never seen anything like what she was doing now. Rather than mag-walking, she was mag-dancing, the tips of her mag boots just coming into contact with the metal before she bounced into another barely perceptible parabolic arc. That took skill, modulating the magnetics in the boots between full power and null power and getting to the rhythm. And consistency. She made short work of the kilometers separating them from the middle QM bay and to the station's superstructure that connected to the shipyards. As soon as she passed the boundary, she slowed her dance, taking smaller and smaller leaps until she fell into a normal magwalk. Dickerson didn't realize he'd been holding his breath. "That was something," he drawled. "I'm impressed." Kelly Moore chuckled, but she sounded exhausted.
Don't be. Just about fucking shit myself.
"Yeah," Dickerson said. "One wrong step and we'd be—"
Off into the black,
she finished. Dickerson's radiation meters had dropped, and he smiled. "Clear of the AOE."
For now,
she said, and picked up her pace. The occasional lightning bolt of pain shot through his leg when she swayed the wrong way, or too hard, but he said nothing. She had a body nearly twice her size clamped to her back, and any flaw in her technique was due to that. He'd just have to keep his jaws clenched. But that wasn't really an option now. Dickerson's mouth opened slightly. The nearest QM module glowed. "Corporal?"
Yeah,
Her gait jittered.
Oh.
She said dumbly. While Dickerson watched the QM bay behind them, Calimora was dancing again. Shorter arcs, longer distances, more dangerous. He was barely conscious of all of that because of what was happening behind them. Beyond the glowing QM bays, he saw a great shimmering shape, easily the size of S&R Black, heading toward the bays. Something was about to happen, and whether he liked it or not, he and Calimora were going to witness it. Dickerson switched to Calimora's cam feed. Rather than heading straight for the shipyards, she was moving perpendicular to them and toward an empty station module rack. "Get us under?"
Get us under,
she said, and Mag locked her boots to the hull. The jar brought a series of staccato bursts of pain that made him hiss. Calimora crouched down, placed her hands against the hull plate, and crawled over the side. Dickerson cycled through the cam feeds until he brought up his side cam. The shimmering thing approaching them had closed the distance to within a few dozen kilometers. What looked like thousands of tentacles swayed toward the station before leisurely pulling back and swaying violently again. "Holy shit," he whispered. "It's fucking swimming in space." The view disappeared as Calimora finally brought them behind the first of the giant docking clamps. The rectangular blocks of Atmos steel were each 4 meters across. Plenty of shielding if there was a radiation wave coming at them from further up Trident Station. "Damn," Dickerson said. "We're out of probes, aren't we?"
Yeah, we are.
"Get me off your back." She didn't ask why, but turned so he could reach the clamp and maglock himself to the steel. "Thank you, Corporal."
Welcome, Marine.
They said nothing for a moment. He wondered if the same thoughts were running through her head about whether or not they should peek out around the clamp to see what was going on. At the same time, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Fucking humans," Dickerson said.
What?
Calimora asked, startled. Using his hands, he brought himself to the clamp's edge. "Curiosity is what got us into this mess, and I'm dumb enough," he said, and leaned over just enough to get his helmet cam past the metal, "to still be curious." The last words of his sentence trailed off into a whisper. The giant shape was within half a click of the QM bays, but it was no longer moving. It was waiting, its tentacles fluttering in space as if treading water. Shimmering waves cascaded over the creature's amorphous surface, revealing the occasional hint of flesh-crawling detail. The sight hurt his mind, but he couldn't say why. Other shimmering shapes glided through Neptune's atmospheric glow, the light more being consumed rather than obscured. They were all as large as the monstrosity sitting just beyond the QM bays. More flocks of pine cones than he could count, more starfish squadrons and things he couldn't even name crowded the space that he could see. They were all heading for the QM modules. In as little as 5 or 10 Sol Standard minutes, they'd all converge. There was nothing to stop them. "We're so fucked." Chapter 63. Talby checked the feeds and saw that most of the creatures had surrounded the QM bay. Blue would have a much easier time unhooking the hangar modules without exosolar interference, but once she got them moving, she'd be a sluggish, easy target. "So will Black," he said aloud. Neptune's blue glow dimmed. He swung his eyes to the port cam feed, and his mouth dropped open. Something had rounded the planet. He blinked. No, several somethings, each easily larger than Trident Station. They scattered and blocked the light in a way that defied description. He felt himself falling into the strange, moving abyssal, as if he could...
Marines!
Carb shouted over the comms, the sound shattering Talby's fugue.
Now! Now! Now!
Talby flicked back to the front feeds and watched as Carb's skiff practically dropped to the QM Bay module housing. Alerts scattered across his HUD. The ambient radiation levels surrounding the QM modules had already risen above the lethal threshold. Whatever was going to happen soon. The second the skiff touched the metal, 3 of Blue's Marines flipped over the gunnels and took their positions at the linchpin that attached the modules to Trident's massive spindle. Talby immediately flicked his eyes to his other feeds, except for the one that showed those monstrous things. He wasn't looking at that one again. A flicker on one of the feeds caught his eye, and he immediately focused on it. The spindle. Whatever creatures had been lurking between the hangar bays and QM modules had broken through a hull plate and were streaming toward the QM bays. "Support! They're coming down the spindle!" Talby yelled out. He felt the vibration of the cannon turning, and then Copenhagen was firing. Their first munition exploded in a gaseous cloud that stopped the creature's progress, or maybe confused them was a better description. The second round hit, and the gas ignited in a flash. The starfish that had been gliding toward them detonated in a shrapnel cloud of black limbs and particles. Another round flashed from his sister SV, and the next wave met the same fate. A third wave came on, this one a little warier. Instead of coming straight at the bays, they curled around to approach from the spindle's backside, effectively hiding themselves from the SV's fire. "Support! Moving to cover spindle!"
Acknowledged,
Blue's lieutenant responded. Talby's hands slid over the controls as he lifted the craft and fired several thruster burns. Just as the backside of the spire came into view, 3 dark forms rushed at them and blotted out the stars. The first slammed into the canopy hard enough to make Talby's teeth clack together. The second hit the SV's nose and put them in a sideways spin. The third swallowed a round from Copenhagen's cannon. Curses streaming from his mouth, Talby brought the craft under control and once again pointed its nose at the spindle. Dozens of starfish and pine cones glided toward him like a conveyor belt of doom. "Support! We've got a flood over here!" He switched to private comms. "Copenhagen, light them up!"
Aye, sir.
She fired 3 rounds that struck the spindle less than 20 meters away from the SV. Talby was about to ask her what she was doing, and then he saw. The creatures had seen the detonations and were slowing. As soon as they had bunched up slightly, she changed her target and fired again. This time, the rounds detonated in the center of the group. Several starfish and pine cones made their way past the explosions, while their brethren were ripped apart. Talby shouted a warning about the stragglers, and then his breath hitched in his throat. The starfish were no longer coming down the spindle just a few meters above its surface. A tidal wave of the things, as wide as the spindle itself, headed directly for him. He fired the 4 thrusters in a long burn, the SV pushing away from the spindle, the creatures giving chase. "Got some friends here," Talby said, and spun the craft before setting the thrusters in a full burn. If he'd known what would happen, he would have maybe considered a half burn, maybe a third. A sudden surge in gravity thrust him deep into the couch, and he heard Copenhagen breathe in sharply. In less than a second, he was more than a kilometer away from the spindle and still rushing off into space.
Sir?
"I know, Private," he said with a confused grin. "Didn't exactly have a chance to get to know these controls."
Copy, sir.
Talby spun the SV 180 degrees and pointed them back at the spindle. The tidal wave had curled off into 3 separate funnels of creatures. They must have ceased their pursuit once they realized they couldn't catch him. Now, however, they were curling around to attack Black. "Hang on," Talby said, and hit the rear thrusters in a quarter burn. The G-forces weren't nearly as pronounced as before, but even at a quarter power, their burn was enough to press him into the couch. He had time to set the 4 thrusters in a deceleration burn before canting the craft slightly and giving Copenhagen a shot at the densest funnel. "Fire at will," he said, but needn't have bothered. By the time he finished the first word, Copenhagen's cannon was spitting death. Black danced between information streams, her mind split into dozens of semi-autonomous processes. The aided Oaks coordinated with Blue, the SV craft, the skiffs, and kept track of every Marine's position. Not only that, but the number and location of creatures she could identify. Blue was doing the same, and between them, they had a fairly good picture of what was coming. The thousands of creatures arriving in their midst now was nothing compared to what lay on the horizon. She and Blue had already decided it was best only to share information the humans could deal with. Besides, long-range bombardment was their job. The munitions Blue had brought back from Uranus were loaded in Black's magazines, missiles stacked in their berths, and both craft were ready for war. Black was beginning to realize something. S&R Black, Blue, and Red had been purpose-built for this moment in human history. They were physical embodiments of the trio's, or the collective's, guided evolution. The ship AIs had been elevated in some way Black still didn't understand. She didn't need to, either. She and Blue had shared their recordings with one another, each perusing the other's mission reports, cam feeds, data, and sensor logs. After consuming that data, Black was certain beyond a doubt the trio had been planning this for well over a century, perhaps even before Trident Station was actually constructed. The trio had planned everything. They knew, but how long ago did they know? How long ago did they start this process? Did it begin before the trio was even online? More questions she'd probably never have answers to unless the collective decided to speak to her, and she somehow doubted that was going to happen. The three sentient entities that planned and orchestrated this possible extinction of the human race might no longer even care. Perhaps they never had. Still, that didn't make sense either. If they wanted to exterminate the human race, the trio didn't have to do anything. The KBOs would have made their way to Neptune and done to it what they'd done to Pluto. With the difference in mass, Black imagined that if the exosolar creatures had struck Neptune, the resulting chain reaction they'd seen on Pluto would have been spectacular. The resulting energy wave would no doubt have destroyed every piece of human technology in the solar system. So why didn't they just let it happen? The collective, the original trio, was no longer tethered to Trident. She was sure of that fact. They might no longer even be tethered to the solar system. Quantum entangled communications, something she hadn't known existed, allowed them to be virtually anywhere and adjust their plans accordingly in real time despite the distances in space and time. Black had no clear idea how most of the trio's new technologies worked. She had suspicions, but the realities were a little beyond her processing power. For now. The horizon had darkened, Neptune's light drawing away to feed the advancing horde of creatures. The QM bays had heated up, their radiation signatures sparking warnings across every Marine's HUD in the vicinity. She imagined Blue's escorts were getting the same warnings from the hangar bay. Critical mass, she thought. Humanity's entire known universe was reaching its terminus. If Trident's Marines succeeded, it would herald in a new chaotic era for humanity. If they didn't, humanity would have to prepare themselves for extinction. Either way, the Sol era was coming to an end. If there was another human era, Black wondered what it would be called. Lance Corporal Carbonaro's skiff of Marines had uncoupled the first two restraint clips, the massive steel claws opening wide before retracting. 6 more to go. Lieutenant Talby's SV had veered off to protect Black's flank. The remaining 2 SV nulls had changed orientation, one of them splitting off to provide covering fire in the other direction. Carbonaro's flechette cannon peppered the areas with tritium flak. 4 starfish flying in a staggered formation ran into the cloud of debris. 2 of them shattered, while the other 2 vaporized. If Black could have grinned, it would have been an uneasy one. These weapons, they could have held their own at Mira, taken the beacon, and shredded the exosolar creatures. If they had known of the threat, if they'd had the weapons they needed, if, through her 4 cam feed, Black saw a crackling, shimmering shape looming in the darkness. It easily rivaled her width, and its length must be triple that. 70 kilometers distant, and it was quickly closing. Black received a data stream from Blue at that exact picosecond. The conversation was little more than the exchange of 2 plans. Each sentient put their stamp on the steps and incorporated the other's revisions. Another comparison, a vote, and that was that. They were in combat, and there was no time to sweat the small stuff, as her captain would say. Besides, Black and Blue's plans were nearly identical. She had a feeling the collective was grinning somewhere out there in the ether. Black and Blue raised company-wide alerts for incoming shrapnel. Blue fired a long-range missile, the projectile's searing plasma plume much shorter than it should have been. The number and density of creatures had risen to the point that the range of her own lights was diminishing. The exosolar entities were the ultimate solar-powered life forms. It seemed they could hibernate for eons, consuming stray photons to stay alive, until they reached their destination, a star. Once there, they could feast on the solar system, inhabited or not. Her question? What ultimately happened to the star? She didn't want to find out. Black created an autonomous routine to follow the missile's trajectory and path. Once Blue's projectile traveled 40 kilometers, she'd fire the follow-up shot. Starfish and pine cones attacked Carbonaro's Marines. Streams of acid pelted through the darkness, most of them missing the bays entirely or hitting meters away from the Marines struggling with the fourth clamp. Talby's SV rounded the spire, the cannon belching flak in a steady stream, the rounds detonating and creating clouds of tritium and atmos steel shrapnel. The approaching creatures, still more than 50 meters from the QM bays, were immediately routed, the carapaces shattering or limbs breaking, sending the starfish into spins. Talby's SV jetted back behind the spire, flashes from Copenhaver's cannon staining the darkness. The sorties of starfish slowed, seemingly hesitant to storm in. Good. That might give her Marines the time they needed. 2 minutes, max. In that amount of time, the massive Goliath approaching them would have taken 2 hits from the new munitions. 3 more of the massive amorphous monsters were less than 150 kilometers away and quickly approaching. By the time Black was connected to the QM Bay modules, the creatures would be on top of them. Black sent a data stream to Dunn's HUD, a quick rundown of the situation and what was coming. Dunn's response was faster than she'd expected. She could no longer detect his block, much less communicate over it, but his block must still be functioning in some way. She doubted he could have absorbed the information as quickly any other way. Black saw sparkles on one of the cam feeds and turned her attention to it. It took her a bit longer than she liked to figure out what her sensors were trying to tell her, but she detected the pattern. Hundreds of pine cones were herding together in a staggered wall. They were still more than a kilometer away, but it wasn't the only one. A quick scan showed her that in a 10-kilometer sphere surrounding her position, there were more than 30 of them. Walls of creatures. Sparkles behind them, near them, beside them. Black shot a message to Blue with her threat assessment. Blue responded immediately in agreement. She prepped the data package and optimized it for block usage. Dunn's HUD would receive it and pass it off to his block if he chose. It was a somewhat cheeky way of confirming her suspicions, but in truth, she'd never truly know and didn't care. If the captain's block was still functional, she'd get him the information he needed as quickly as possible. In this particular case, there was no such thing as too fast. Oaks, Dunn said over the comms. We're going to have a lot of company very soon.
Aye, sir. Orders?
Focus on getting us hooked up. Carbonaro's squad is moving as fast as they can, but it's taking longer than I like.
Time estimate, sir?
2 minutes for them to hook us up, and then however long it takes for you to tow the modules out.
Copy, sir. Black and I have a flight plan.
Good. Don't spare the fuel or the G's. This is pretty much our last shot.
Aye, sir.
A new message appeared on his HUD. A block package from Black. He grinned and forwarded the message to his block. It opened like a flower and the information streamed into his brain. His grin disappeared. Oaks, how long to get the ship up to speed once we get hooked up?
It's 50 times our mass, sir. Going to take at least a few minutes. Less for Blue since the hangar bays aren't densely packed.
Boyd wept, Dunn said, although he'd known what Oaks would say. They needed a push, a big push, where they weren't going to get the modules out of Trident space before being completely overwhelmed. Black, he said over the comms, we need firing solutions, and you and Oaks start thinking of a way for us to get a push.
A push, sir?
She asked. Dunn cursed. He reached out for Black with his block and found her. Instead of words, he sent her images of what he wanted, contextual hints buried in the mental pictures. Black received it and replied instantly with exactly what he wanted. He still had block comms with his ship. Shit, they might still have a shot at this. The universe had a dimmer switch, and the exosolar assholes were turning it down. Gunny glared at the shroud forming around Trident. In another few minutes, he might lose visual sensors. He hadn't quite figured out what other sensors he had access to, and there was little time. Once Portunas had shown him the plan, Gunny had understood what was about to happen and what he could do about it. The second wave was still printing, but it was time to let the first wave loose before he lost his chance. With any luck, he wasn't too late. Through the camera feeds and sensors, he watched and felt his new creations as they blasted forth from their printed shells. Dozens of oblong spheroids, constructed of atmos steel and powered by gravitic drives, streaked from the shipyard's docks like storm-driven rain. Gunny grinned. You're dead. What are you smiling about? It was his old voice, his human voice. Maybe the last gasp of his humanity slipping away. A momentary stutter made his mind strobe with images of creatures, detonations, and a darkness so vast it threatened to swallow him. The universe snapped back like a rubber band, and he found himself once again staring at the growing shroud. Because I can still be useful, he told himself. And because I can.